everyone. Welcome. So happy to see everybody here. I am Kate, your In-House Connect host. For those of you who don't already know me, please let me know that you can see me, hear me, see all of our wonderful presenters by popping into the chat. Put your name, where you are from, and what the weather is like where you are. As I said, I'm Kate. I'm here in currently sunny and humid St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm going to throw it around to our wonderful presenters. John, where are you? How is it where you are?
So I am in sunny Redwood City. When you come in here, there's actually a sign that says we have the best climate in all the country. I don't know if that's still true because it's warmed up a bit over the years, but yeah, it's lovely here. So yeah, hi everyone. So my name is John Lee. I'm the general counsel and head of strategy here at Ruli. Previous to joining Ruli, I was at another legal AI company, Ivo, as general counsel there. And then previous to that, I was at one of Google's investment funds as mostly a deal lawyer during my time there. And then previous to that, I was like an M&A VC corporate lawyer for a long time. So basically, I know very little about information security. So I'm very excited to be here and that Gary and Anna and Alex agreed to present this because I'm very excited to learn a lot of this stuff as well. Because a GC at an AI company, like information security, I feel like is probably the most important topic related to AI in terms of as a provider of AI tools.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much to John and Ruli for sponsoring this webinar. We really appreciate you, and I'm also excited to learn. Anna, how about you? How is it where you are?
Yeah, my name's Anna. I'm a partner in the cyber practice at A. Sherman, and I'm told as a cyber lawyer, I just bring my own dark clouds with me everywhere. But no, I'm in New York. It's a little cloudy, but I do sometimes meet people always in a way where I'm darkening their doorstep. Nice to meet you.
But not today. Not today. We're all
Not
happy to have
today.
you here, Anna. Gary, how about you?
Very similar, actually. It's usually not a good day when I call, but today it is. So I'm Gary. I'm from San Jose. My background is I'm currently a security architect at Adobe, and I have past roles being the Chief Information Security Officer for payments at Facebook and lead architect at Apple and at eBay. I've been all over Silicon Valley. So happy to talk about information security here today.
Great. Alex, I saw you just take a drink, so if you're ready,
I'm
let us
ready. That's right.
know.
Yeah, so I'm in San Francisco. It's actually sunny outside of my window today, which is nice because it's usually cold in the summer, but it's been unusually cold the past couple weeks. Great to see my fellow panelists. I'm Alex Tuma. I'm a partner at Allen Overy and Sherman in the San Francisco office. So I practice in the technology transactions group and work on a variety of agreements related to technology, fintech, blockchain, AI, whatever the technology of the day is. I do intellectual property, licensing, product counseling, and anything related to technology. Like John, I've encountered InfoSec issues throughout my career, and I know nothing. I've had the fortune of being able to rely on people like Anna, my colleague, and I've had the pleasure of working with Gary over the years, in particular on InfoSec exhibits. And from the technical side, he is a wizard when it comes to this stuff. So it's great to have him on the panel today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists. And we are so excited to get started. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. I am going to end this poll and kick it over to all of you.
Great. Thank you, Kate. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I guess at the start of this conversation, we can all ask, why do we care about information security? Obviously, it's becoming a bigger issue every day. We're seeing more and more information security and cyber attacks in the headlines. So I thought at the beginning, it would be interesting to cover a few stats of some recent trends. One example of a recent cyber attack was the 2023 attack on MGM Resorts, which disrupted their hotel and casino properties, their online systems, reservations, digital room keys. So huge disruption to the business, which is pretty common for these types of attacks. And important maybe from the legal lens is there was $100 million loss. And I think around January of this year, there was a class action settlement for $45 million arising from data breaches as a result of that attack and a prior attack. So there are obviously practical issues that arise from these breaches, or physical issues, I should say, and then there's monetary liability and other liability that arise. So as we all look at legal liability, it's important to think about these ramifications. There's a well-known report called the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, which analyzes every year data breaches from the prior year. And this year's report in 2025 looked at 22,000 security incidents. And what was interesting was incidents involving third parties has doubled year over year and now presents 30% of all breaches. So this highlights the risks from doing business with vendors, service providers, and supply chain partners. And as we look at InfoSec exhibits and other related provisions and agreements, it's important to think about what risk allocation measures we can put in place to properly allocate risk between the parties. The report noted there was also an increase in ransomware, and common issues related to attacks and data breaches are the human element, social engineering, misuse, stolen credentials. So it's important for all of us to think about our own practices and to ensure that the companies we work for have proper InfoSec practices and that our counterparts in agreements are also bound to sufficient practices. We can go to the next slide. And so Gary or Anna, I guess I'll let you start off by telling us what we mean by information security.
Sure, I'll take that. So when we talk about information security, we're really generally talking about three things. So the first, and what I think most people think about when they're thinking about information security, is keeping our secret. So if there's sensitive information that your firm or your client has, we want to make sure that only the people they authorize have access to that. And we call that property confidentiality. The second pillar of information security is integrity. So this is about keeping data what you expected it to be when you're not looking at it. So this can be really important if you think about something like a payment account. If anybody's familiar with the story Office Space, right? One of the things that happened there was they took an account that was supposed to receive some funds and they changed it on the back end. There are lots of examples of integrity though, like somebody were to change a 10-Q report while you weren't looking at it, that could be a really difficult problem for a client. And then finally, there's the property of availability, which is making sure that your systems are up for authorized uses and that information is available when you need it. So when we think about things like ransomware attacks, that's an availability attack, and an availability attack can be really devastating. There are lots of aspects of availability that don't have to do with information security. Systems can just go down, but what we're really talking about here is an availability attack in the face of an attacker who's trying to disrupt the business of a firm. So we take those three things together, and that is what is information security in this context.
I think moving just to the next slide, I think the question we get a lot as lawyers is this my problem? And unfortunately, it is. This is just a recent survey. It's from 2022. It's an ACC, which is how high of a priority cybersecurity has become at the general counsel level. I would say in our practice, we do a lot of work for both the general counsel, legal counsel, but also we do a lot of work directly for CISOs or the information security team as well. And that's because it's just an increasingly legalized space. This is information security addendums, thinking about the increasing number of breach notification regulations, as well as the operational resilience regulations that are being passed to ensure basically return to operations. So there's one more poll question, and then Gary, we can move to the next slide.
I'll just get out of that.
Yeah, we'll give everyone, but yeah, is it a legal department problem question? But it's interesting to see the breakdown. It's actually, there are more no's than I would think because it is such an increasingly heavily regulated space.
So again, the different kinds of incidents that people might end up seeing. So ransomware, again, is an availability attack. And so what this generally looks like is an attacker comes in with some malware, i.e. software that's under their control. And what that malware does is it encrypts the user's data. The reason it does this is so that it can do it secretly. So the software includes a decryption key. So everything looks very transparent to the user. But then once a sufficient amount of their data is encrypted, then they will delete the decryption key and then demand a ransom to get that encryption key back. So if the target doesn't have good backups, or even if they do, it can take a long time to restore those backups. And so waiting for that can create some disruption. And this can be a really devastating attack, and there's a lot of that. You can also do extortion without the ransomware. If you steal a bunch of, say, really sensitive customer data, and you, as the attacker, promise to give it back if they pay the ransom, that can be a good way for an attacker to profit. If you're familiar with the very well publicized incident for Uber that happened a few years ago that ended in the prosecution of the CISO at the time, that is an example of extortion without ransomware. Business email compromise is an interesting one because it's so easy. I saw a few of these at various places in my career. And basically what this looks like is you compromise a user's email account, or even you can just do this with phishing, but so you'll end up with an email that looks like it's coming from, say, a key supplier. This is a big way that I've seen it done to a company. And then that supplier says, hey, please change my bank account. I used to be that, but now it's changed to this one. And then please send any future payments to that bank account. Of course, it didn't actually come from the supplier. And so a business ends up paying the wrong company for some amount of time. A software compromise is an incident that has to do with software from a third-party vendor. This can happen any number of ways, and depending on what that breach is, can be really devastating. IP theft, espionage, and insider threat. So these can all be a little bit different, but essentially what we're looking at there is an attack on the confidentiality of the intellectual property that a firm has, depending on the value of that property, that can be really devastating. We're also seeing a lot of like espionage and insider threat. So espionage looks a lot like that, but it's usually driven by a nation state instead of a financially motivated criminal. And insiders can help that happen. One interesting thing that a lot of firms are seeing right now are North Korean intelligence agents, or people who are in the employ of them, getting hired as internal vendors. And they both get paid a salary, which in North Korea can be really meaningful. And then they also use their position to steal information. Supply chain compromise is one of the ways that software compromise can happen. And go ahead.
Hey, Gary. So actually, you did bring up an interesting point on these types of incidents. So I actually have a question for you. In terms of like backups, I'm sure that's like a pretty important thing. Every organization should have a good backup policy. But like,
Indeed.
how useful is actually having the backup to resolve these types of incidents if it takes so long to, like you pointed out, to put those back in place, or from a technical point of view? I'd be very curious about that.
Yeah, backups are not at all helpful. Again, let's come back to that sort of three-pillar pyramid, right? Where we talk about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Backups are not helpful at all in terms of a confidentiality attack. The problem is that an attacker also has your data. So you have it too, great, but your attacker has it. Where backups are most helpful are in terms of integrity and availability attacks. So if we think about ransomware as the classic availability attack, having a backup is absolutely critical. The reason being that just because you pay the ransom does not guarantee that you're going to get the key. It's not like these guys offer amazing customer support, right? So you could pay the ransom and then not get your data back. Additionally, it's really common for crime actors, they share information and they know who pays. So if you've gotten an existing ransomware attack, they're gonna share that with other people, and other people are going to attack you again because they know that you're likely to pay. You absolutely have to have that information, even if it's causing an outage while you get that information restored. The outage could be forever if you don't actually get that decrypted. Integrity is very similar, right? Imagine you're a healthcare provider and all of your patients' health records were subtly altered, right? It might not be obvious, right? So even though you're having an outage, it's really important to have that backup. And these days with cloud computing, it's not unreasonable to leave the existing system up if it's partially serviceable, and then to create a new instance of your application, restore the data, do some testing there, and then cut over users when they're ready.
Picking up, I think the last one is hardware and product security compromise. I think that's exactly what it sounds like, which is essentially compromise at the hardware level. Not super common. I'd say from a traditional threat actor standpoint, this is usually going to be conducted at the state level. So building a backdoor into the hardware itself. We've seen a number of those, but I think that covers the attack paths. We can move on to the next two slides.
Cool. And I think I'm going to take this one. So again, this data is from the Verizon DBIR. If you're interested in these topics, highly recommend that you give that a look. It doesn't cost anything. The link is in the beginning of this presentation, verizon.com/DBIR. And you can see a lot of really interesting things about trends, which can help you protect your clients around the kind of things that they're seeing. But so what this slide is trying to show are, we'll talk a little bit more about the entire path that an attacker generally takes. We call that the cyber kill chain. But what's the first step in that path? And so that's what this slide is showing you. Credential abuse is about stealing or otherwise using passwords, access keys. These days, if your clients are using Amazon AWS, API keys for AWS are a really common factor for that. So they could be stolen via GitHub is a common place. They could bribe employees to get those. They could be in software that's shipped to customers and pulled out of that software. So any value that's intended to be secret and can be used to access something of value is what we call a credential. Exploitation of vulnerabilities is what Anna was talking about earlier with a software compromise. If there is a piece of software that can be exploited on somebody's network to allow access without that credential, or allow remote code execution, which is the most damaging kind of exploitation of vulnerability, where an attacker can run arbitrary code or software of their choice on the user system. About 20% of the attacks that we're seeing result from that. And we'll talk about how that results also or relates to the cyber kill chain. And then finally, it's 2025. I'm shocked that we're still saying this in 2025, but phishing still really works. In a classic sense, phishing tricks users into submitting usernames and passwords into a system under control of attackers. So usually that's going to look like a login form for a site that they expected to see. But these days, you're also seeing people phish two-factor codes, like the kinds you get via SMS when you think you're protecting your system. You can use it to install malware or any sort of other sort of attacks. These are all still really prevalent today.
But AI is making some of the phishing emails, I'd say, really good.
Yeah, it's not enough to like look for misspellings or stuff that looks like no marketing department would ever approve it. AI is making this look a lot better. So the things around actually looking to see the domain that something came from can be more important skills. So I imagine phishing resistance programs for firms are more important than ever. So also, human factors and third parties are really important. Again, 60% of breaches involve the human element. And so if we think about a lot of things that we're talking about earlier with insider threat, with phishing, et cetera, like these all involve a human user. But another thing I want to consider for just a moment is misconfiguration. So misconfiguration by a human is really common. So we could think of misconfiguration like even a human not putting their secrets into a secret management system, but instead just putting them into source code, usually just for now. And then they forget it's just for now and they push that source code up to GitHub and they leak credentials that way. Or another really common one is some piece of cloud infrastructure like a Amazon S3 bucket has a configuration that allows the public to access it. Again, usually developers are like, oh, I'm going to fix that later. It's just for now. And then they forget. And then they put a bunch of customer data in it and somebody notices and steals that data. Also, third parties, as Alex mentioned, are really common in breaches these days. So this is directly relevant to all of you working on security exhibits with third parties for your clients. Transitive obligations and security contracts. Most vendors will have vendors of their own, and so making sure that those security requirements are transitive is really important. There's a bunch more great data in the DBIR, and again, I recommend that if you're at all interested, download it and give it a look. But for now, let's take a look at the security controls and contracts and how those line up both against the DBIR and the cyber kill chain.
Actually, so another random question,
Yep.
Gary. Yeah. So I feel like a lot of SaaS providers, they, for example, we're SOC 2 certified, SOC 2 Type 2 certified. I know there's like an ISO certification. Like how effective do you think those are? And I feel like that's table stakes really for any type of SaaS type company that deals with like important data. And so like how effective do you think those are in terms of cutting down on these types of factors of incidents or intrusion?
So like SOC 2 reports, ISO 27000 reports are very useful. The reason is because they're generally audited by a third party. So you don't just have to take the subject of the contract's word that they're doing these things, you actually get some proof that they're doing them. That said, the controls, particularly those that go into a SOC 2 report, they're very flexible, right? Like the subject can determine these are the controls that I want to have tested to some extent. And so you actually have to read them. and see if those controls line up against the controls that are required in a security exhibit. Also, ISO 27000, it's a good standard, but it's quite old, right? It's been around for a couple of decades. Same, right? Like there are controls in there that would be very useful and they're third party attested. So that's really important. But there may be things that aren't covered in there that you would like. Kate, I see your face has popped up. That usually means you have something to say. And anything there to add there to my answer to John before we jump over to the kill chain?
No, I think as we get into the kill chain and the agreements, the way I would think of cybersecurity prevention is almost like Swiss cheese, but you like layer it on. So if each piece has a hole, you hope that the holes are entirely covered by the time you layer them. Because when you see the kill chain, you'll see how they are maneuvering through gaps at each layer of security.
Yeah, that's a great segue. Let's jump into that.
If I can ask, with all these different types of attacks and the degrees or the types of attacks changing, how often do you recommend people to get their InfoSec exhibits looked at? And do people need to really assess partner by partner? Or is there a more holistic approach a company can take? For example, a smaller company with less resources where maybe they can't pull in a specialist for every deal.
That's a really great question. Yeah, attacks do change year over year. I certainly wouldn't recommend leaving your exhibit untouched for years and years. When I was working on these for corporations, I would usually at least give them a look every year. As the lead for a lot of these, I would work with people like you, Alex, to negotiate these with third parties. And sometimes just in the process of that negotiation, you'd be like, oh, we're not covering this thing that we're starting to see these days. It's a good indicator to look at that. In terms of whether you have the same one for every vendor, that's a really great point. So it really depends on the information and access that you're giving a vendor. And often I would end up having different kinds of templates depending on the access that vendor would have. If we had a contract with, I don't know, like a custodial service, for example, and they didn't have access to sensitive areas like inside our data centers, we could go very light touch for them, right? Like background checks and a couple other things and we're good. But if you're talking about a vendor that has full-time, always-on remote access to your systems and thus access to all your data, we'd often throw in a few extra controls for them. So a risk-based approach can be really helpful there. Any other questions before we move on to the kill chain?
We did have a couple of quick questions in the chat, if you're willing to field them right now, Gary.
Yeah, I think so. We're about halfway through. We might not quite get to the end, but yeah, let's keep it interactive.
And we do technically have until we have about another hour with Q&A.
Oh, that's right.
So
That's
you
right.
need to run over a little bit. It's not.
No, let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and ask the questions. Let's keep
Yeah.
people engaged.
Okay, so one was, is there a more current cybersecurity framework that would be helpful to look for?
Yeah, there are quite a few actually, but one of the ones that I have found to be most useful is something called the Center for Internet Security Top 20. It's a bit newer than ISO 27000. It's quite comprehensive. It's intended to say these are the top 20 controls that firms should be using, but it's actually more than that. It's hundreds. They subdivide these controls into others. So I use that like a laundry list of have we considered most of the things that we might need to consider when designing a security program.
The other question is, could you give an example that is not covered in SOC 2 Type 2, but good to know?
Sure. Yeah. So again, like SOC 2 Type 2, at least in the places where I've worked on these, the subject is often saying that these are my controls, right? These are the controls that I want to put in place and have tested. And then the auditor actually assesses if those controls are in place and effective. So like I said, you really have to read it and see what controls they've decided to put in place. If there's really glaring weaknesses, the editor might say, hey, we got to test this control or that control. So for example, test restores of backups may not be in scope for a SOC 2, but it might be critically important if you're looking at data that you really have to have access to. If you as a lawyer are protecting your client and you're aware that there are particular controls that would be really important for the kind of engagement that you're doing, actually look through the SOC 2 and see if those controls were part of it. So it really, I can't answer that flatly because there isn't any one control. You have to look to see which controls are in scope for that SOC 2 and make sure that if you don't have them tested there, perhaps some other third-party attestation is there. Okay, you're muted, but I think that was a thank you. And
It
you're off
was.
camera.
I
So
think I unmuted myself way too briefly. I thought I was being too smooth about it.
I'm really glad we did not decide to do a live demo here, by the way. I just feel like that would have been really testing the presentation gods a little too closely. So let's talk about the kill chain for a minute. The cyber kill chain it's essentially like a framework to think about attacks. It was developed by Lockheed a bunch of years ago, but it's still really useful. So it's a framework to consider attacker actions and behaviors in kind of a typical breach. So let's talk about what these different phases are. So generally, first is going to be reconnaissance. So this is casing a target. It could involve mapping the internet presence of what a target is. You could look in the news for collaborations of deals between them and additional targets. That might be ways to get in. You could look at LinkedIn to find people who work there. You could actually drive to the location and physically surveil them and see what this operates. Basically, anything about the target is fair game. So one key activity for a typical attack on recon would be to scan your target's internet presence and see if you can find that they have software installed that have known vulnerabilities. That's pretty quick. It's pretty easy. So next, once they know what the target is and what their soft points are, they'll tie together some sort of a human or machine vulnerability with a remote access tool. And so we'll call this weaponization. Some things that I've used before when we're trying to test a company's security, like the company that I work for, you might tie together like a juicy news article or a USB key with a juicy name on it. And then you can tie that together with code that's designed to take advantage of a system vulnerability and deploy a rat. A rat is a remote access Trojan. One of the interesting things that we did back when I was at Facebook is somebody from the security team posted a fake news article that was very convincing, saying an entire Facebook employee shuttle had gotten pulled over for DUI, and 1,000 people clicked on it. And then we used that to do a red team test. So next, delivery. So how are we going to deliver that weaponized tool to the target? Are we going to send them a phishing email? Are we going to send them a USB stick? Are we going to deliver it right over the internet in the case of a vulnerability? Physical attacks can work well too. If we can actually get into the network, we usually physically and plug into a network port. There's usually a lot more attack surface that's available to us than coming in off the internet. Okay, so next we've got exploitation. So the weaponized tool is executed within the security perimeter of the target. So again, employee clicks on the attachment or clicks on the link, and that vulnerability gives the attacker the ability to install additional software, which takes us to installation. So the tool is deployed within the target security perimeter. And so now it has a foothold within their network, within their firewall, and the attacker can achieve lateral movement. So they can use that foothold almost like a beachhead to start looking at additional things that could be attacked. Once the remote access tool is installed, then command and control is going to happen. So what that usually looks like is the remote access tool is reaching back out, usually over the internet, but it could be all over. A command and control can happen via Instagram posts, for example, right? Or it can happen via GitHub, and it can blend into traffic that you're used to seeing on your network. But any place where you can write something and read something can be used as a command control system. So what this allows the attacker to do is to remotely control what their remote access Trojan is doing inside the network. And then finally, exfiltration. So as you're doing this lateral movement and command and control, you're worming your way out through the victim's network, you're going to find things that are valuable. So if we're talking about a confidentiality attack, like stealing access codes and keys and IP and perhaps bank account numbers and things like that, the exfiltration phase is where the attacker gets away with their virtual loop. And then, go ahead.
Yeah, so Gary, I guess I'm wondering, obviously a red flag might be you get an email and there's a link in it from somebody you don't know. But what other types of red flags can we keep an eye out for to try to break this chain?
Well, so we'll talk about the different controls here. So each of the controls that we're going to be talking about is about breaking an individual piece of this chain. And again, as Anna was saying, AI has made a lot of the stuff that we might look for before really hard to spot. Misspellings aren't as common anymore. Crappy looking marketing materials aren't as common anymore. Really what you have to look at least for emails, is who is the person who sent this to you? What is their email domain? Is it one that you can actually read it? It can be tricky, particularly for non-technical users. Other things, though, in general, the advice that I give people, particularly those who are non-technical, is to try to be skeptical about messages that are showing up in your computer. Don't install browser extensions unless you're really sure about them, because those can steal access cookies. Don't install other software on your machine if you can avoid it. make sure that you're applying patches so that you don't have these vulnerabilities on your system. Just be really skeptical about essentially anything that comes to you that you didn't solicit.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, as an interesting aside, like since I joined Ruli and also like previously in my at Ivo, I like basically after a month or so after I joined, I kept getting like these text message spam. And it'd be like coming from like my CEO, or it said it'd come from my CEO, and they'd be like, "Hey, I need to talk to you immediately." And it's funny that it just happened in both places. It was not from the CEO; it was from a random number. I actually have their number saved on my phone, so I knew it wasn't from them. But imagine if I didn't, right?
Yeah, yeah. And we see a lot of this fake urgency when people are trying to steal money directly. You get a text or an email purporting to be from the CFO saying, "Hey, I need you to approve this immediately. We're holding up a deal. Please, this is urgent." And that does work on a lot of people. That kind of ties into the being skeptical thing, right? It's hard to be skeptical when you're stressed and you feel like you need to do something right away, but you have to slow down and think. Another interesting development here, John, is that so we're seeing AI on all sorts of attacks, not just the initial phishing piece, but all over. And so a vendor report that I was reading recently, this particular vendor was really interesting. If you guys have seen the Gartner Magic Quadrant of vendors, where they rank a given vendor against their completeness of vision and then their ability to execute, and the best vendors are up and to the right. This vendor did the same thing about attack crews, right? So who are the attack teams that have the most completeness of vision and the most ability to execute, which is funny when you think about it. But the top three are doing $1 billion a year in attack business combined, which is really crazy. And that amount of money allows you to afford a lot of engineering and software development. And so what they're finding from these top attack teams, a lot of really fascinating things that we don't have time to get into today. But one of the most interesting is that they're using AI to automate this attack chain that we're looking at here. And so they are the very best attackers are getting in, weaponizing, doing the lateral movement, using AI to scan for the stuff they want and getting it out in about 7 minutes. So what that really shows is that incident response has gotten very hard for a lot of teams, and then prevention via these tools that we're going to talk about today are really important.
Let's pivot to the exhibits, and then we can come back if we get Anna back. One of the purposes of the exercise today was for all of us to just get a little more technical and get more knowledge regarding these concepts. And in practice, we are, as attorneys, facing these concepts in InfoSec exhibits. And so one of the times I've done this panel with Gary was coming right off of doing a deal where there were all these topics like background check and encryption and physical security and incident response. And while I feel like it's really common to see these things now, 7 years ago when I was looking at agreements, I don't feel like I was seeing these concepts in every single agreement I was looking at. And so there really was the need to get educated on this stuff. So Gary, it would be great if you can take us through some of the topics we may see in an InfoSec exhibit. But I guess before we do that, John, do you have any thoughts, like you've been both on the vendor side, on the customer side, at a law firm, in-house. Like, what are your thoughts about InfoSec exhibits generally, or what are some of the big issues you've seen?
Yeah, I guess from a practical point of view, I think it's very important for like the lawyer reviewing the info security agreement or even drafting it to really connect with the folks on the security side to really understand what the actual policies are and to make sure that your exhibit, whether you're redlining it or drafting it, like actually reflects reality. Because oftentimes you'll have some type of, and here's a poll question. Often you'll have some type of like response time, or it'll talk about some encryption requirements. And you need to understand if that's actually true, if you're going to enter into a contract saying it is. So I think that's first and foremost. And the second main thing I point out is the InfoSec exhibit is often just attached to a main agreement. And so there's a lot of overlap, right? For example, the definitions for data or like what the audit rights are or termination if the security exhibit survives beyond like the agreement or something like that. And like if there are exceptions where the info security agreement goes beyond what's in the main agreement, you need to make sure your integration clause accounts for that. And then also you need to make sure that the requirements in your info security agreement actually do what you need it to do. And if it just defers to the main agreement, then you need to make sure the main agreement is modified in that way. Yeah. And so those are the main things on a higher level. But yeah, obviously would really be interested in hearing, Gary, from your point of view on the information security exhibits, like on the technical side of things and the security side of things, what you would really be looking out for.
Yeah, I like what you said. Another thing to consider is, as an information security advocate for my company, it's not my job to say no, that we can't do a thing. It's usually my job to try to say no, but is there a way we can get to yes? I don't ever want to kill a deal if it can be avoided. And so one thing that's really common is we'll be going through our typical information security exhibit, and a particular vendor has a hard time with a one or more lines in the contract. And so I will typically work with lawyers to try to get to a red line version of the exhibit that still meets our overall security needs. And so we'll talk about some of those complementary control that could be useful. But so I think for this cohort, for all the lawyers that might end up doing some of this redlining, that are looking at some of these things, part of what I'm trying to do here is to plant a seed to say the best thing to do here would be to encrypt this data at rest. But maybe we can't do that in this particular case. So here are some other controls that might work, but you really can't know if they're going to work or not without talking to your information security team. I think anytime we're looking at meaningful material changes to the exhibit via red lines, it has to be a collaboration between legal and the security team. Alex, do you have something more to add?
Yeah, no, just on John's point, I think it's a good one for everyone to think about. A lot of times these exhibits are slapped on as an addendum to the agreement. And in many cases, I've seen the exhibits are perhaps too broad, right? They're trying to sweep in these controls with respect to any data exchanged by the parties, but that could also include data that's not very sensitive. And so it really depends on the type of company you represent and the counterparty, how much of an issue this is going to be. But at a very large enterprise and in a partnership where there's a lot of data being exchanged and it's being routed in different systems, there may be resistance to just having such a broad approach, right? The InfoSec exhibit may need to be tailored so it only applies to highly sensitive data or personal information or certain categories. If you're doing a deal with a smaller player or someone where it's like a one product company, that may be less of an issue because they're willing to just stand behind all of the data is going in one place. But that's a common thing to look at, like the scope of data that's covered by the exhibits. And then certainly survival, indemnification, termination, you want to make sure all of those provisions match up with what you're ultimately negotiating in the main agreement. I've definitely seen cases where parties start to negotiate the main agreement and it's not necessarily in harmony with what's going on in the InfoSec exhibit.
Great
Yeah,
point.
and I guess if I have one other practical suggestion is to, when you work with the security IT folks who are the experts in the technical side of things, it's always good to be, especially initially, I would say instead of just sending a red line over and saying, "Hey, is this okay?" Get on the phone and talk to them because like there are certain nuances to a lot of the stuff that I've come across before that I think I understand, but then I probably don't actually understand. Like with the audit rights, I think, oh, what's a big deal? Like somebody can just come and check our physical premises. That like maybe you can. That doesn't seem that big a deal, maybe, but like then that could end up being a much bigger issue than you suspect. So I would say until like you. And eventually, if you're working with them quite often, you build a rapport, you see where the hot points, hot button issues are. But I think initially, especially, like it's just get on the phone and start talking to the folks.
And Gary, maybe we can do a couple questions from the audience before we go into the specifics. So one of the questions is, how do you handle a vendor who has a one size fits all policy and is not willing to change it for a client? So obviously one answer to that may be the legal, right? How do you address the risk or liability? The other is the technical. What do you do in that case? Is it just no deal or is there some other way to get comfortable? Like through a report, for example.
Yeah, I've been on both sides of that. I've been the vendor that had a one size fits all, and I've also had to work with them. I think there are a few different ways we can do it. One, if senior people in the company are so anxious to do the deal that they're willing to accept the risk, we can do a risk acceptance there, right? I don't want to argue with the CEO of my company, the guy who's paying my checks, as to whether he can do a thing or not if he understands all the risks. So that is one option. Another thing, if we really don't have any wiggle room on what controls can be applied, is we can change the scope of the contract. right? And so given what, your limited capabilities to protect our data, we're going to limit the scope of the data or limit the scope of the systems that you can see and shrink it down to a point where we're comfortable with the we can control. So those are the two approaches that I most commonly take.
Can you
Okay.
guys hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Okay,
Yes.
great. I would say the other thing too is someone I saw in the chat that they're besties with their data security team. I highly recommend that. I think there's an element of explainability here and just being able to talk through the issues. Is a vendor saying they can't do something because they can't do it because it's not applicable to the agreement or because they have compensating controls? I think Gary mentioned complementary controls or compensating controls. You have the opportunity to, if they can't give you one control, write a compensating control into the agreement that might be equal to or more protective than the control you were initially asking for. And you can do that. And that's just a joint exercise between, I think, your InfoSec team and your legal team saying, hey, what can we do if we're going to compensate? What's going to be an equivalent security measure? And then you as the lawyer sit down and figure out how to write that into the agreement. I think often when you sit down and talk, you can figure out a way to get a control that satisfies, I think, the security posture of both parties if you're just willing to think about how the operation is going to work in practice.
Great points.
Okay, so let's move on to, or Kate, I see you're back. Gary, why don't you walk us through some of these InfoSec topics from a technical point of view?
Sure. So let's talk about background checks. I think these are in every information security exhibit that I've ever worked on. They're helpful to ensure that bad actors are not employed within an organization. They're rarely 100% effective. To see how ineffective they are compared to what's possible, look at what your typical background check provides versus a FBI security clearance. Like, they're really not very comprehensive, but they are a bar. They're usually pretty reasonably priced, and a lot of firms are doing this for their own protection anyways. You're probably not going to get a lot of pushback from most people about doing background checks. Note, so what I've included here is a chart from TrustWave showing what different pieces of confidential information are worth on the black market. And so this is created from essentially from ads that you'll see in cybercrime forums about, oh, I've got like this many accounts, I'm willing to sell them to you for this amount. So note that the ones that I outlined in red here, one is bank account access, right? So you can actually steal money directly from a bank account via ACH or other method. This is near and dear to me because I used to work in payments exclusively, so I'd worry about this kind of thing a lot. But note that the other is remote network access. So like a person could give you access, so it jumps through those first hoops around weaponization and recon. It shortcuts that for an attacker. So these two things are exactly the kind of things that would be easy for a bad actor hired into the right part of an organization to get. A really interesting and hard to spot wrinkle here is we're seeing in industry a lot of North Korean operatives, as I mentioned earlier, trying to get jobs at US firms. So they can do this either by stealing an existing identity and they'll use that in their background check. So the background check will come up clean, or for more in-depth ops, they can actually create an entirely new identity. There was a really interesting talk that was given by a senior VP at the security firm CrowdStrike at the RSA conference this year, a big security conference in the Bay Area. And he found a magic bullet to stop these North Korean operatives that I thought was just absolutely fascinating and hilarious. They found that if they asked the North Korean hires something effective, what's your least favorite thing about Kim Jong-un? They just hang up. Like they're so uncomfortable about saying anything negative about the dear leader that they just don't know what to do. They freeze and they hang up. So who knows, maybe something you can use if you suspect this is happening to you or your client.
I've always wondered how thorough the background checks are because, like, you have to go through it many times, like for new jobs or a SOC 2 certification or so on. And my name's John Lee. And so they just get a response and it's clear, obviously, but like after a few days, and I'm, how thorough is this really?
Yeah, it's a bar. It's a bar, right? Unusually, if you're doing a background check, it's not just John Lee. It's John Lee with this SSN and this date of birth and perhaps this driver's license number. But again, it's not that hard to steal somebody's identity to get that information. And then I can apply for a job as you. And if they're not checking my face against my driver's license, which I've never seen happen at an interview, it can be very difficult. Again, with some of these recent threat actors from North Korea, one of the tells is somebody will have, say, a difficult Polish name, for example, right? And then the interviewee can't even say their own name, right? So there are often red flags, but not always. Shall we move on to encryption?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Encryption is a really important security control. It's one of the few things that we have in information security that provably works. We can prove that the math works. And you'll find it everywhere. You'll find it in data protection, to authentication, to malware resistance. It's important to understand what it promises, though. So all this promises that an attacker who has access to encrypted data, which we'll call ciphertext, can't access the decrypted data without the key. So it's not just enough to encrypt the data. You really have to protect the keys and access to those keys. Anna, it sounds like this is near and dear to your heart. You want to chime in?
Yeah, Gary, I think we talked about how I feel about encryption, which is encryption is an amazing tool, and the math literally backs it up. You mathematically cannot break most, even commercially available encryption tools on the market. However, encryption is only as good as the access controls. And for the most part, when we see breaches, we'll have someone say, oh my God, it's encrypted, it's totally fine. But if your credentials or your keys are compromised, then they could essentially decrypt the entire database. They don't need to crack the encryption. So you could have the strongest encryption in the world, but you need to couple that with credential management, privilege access management, or else that encryption is not going to be very valuable. We talked a little bit at the beginning about S3 buckets and misconfigurations on S3 buckets. And the most common ways that a lot of those S3 buckets have historically been popped or compromised is because the credentials were compromised. So even though the S3 bucket itself was fully encrypted, Amazon advertises it fully encrypted, has great, incredible encryption. Once you have compromised or a configuration that's incorrect on the S3 bucket itself, the data for the purpose of that third party accessing the bucket is not encrypted when they go to read it.
100%. Yeah. If we tie that thought that Anna just offered together with the cyber kill chain, what this really helps is around the exfiltration side of if the attacker has exfiltrated ciphertext and it's properly encrypted and they don't have the keys, the exfiltration doesn't matter. It's not a breach. They can't get access to the data that we care about. But if instead they're getting access to that encrypted data through, say, a web application front end that actually needs those decryption keys anyways to operate, the encryption doesn't matter, because they're getting the clear text directly from the web app front end. So it really depends on where the attacker is attempting to steal things from and whether they have access to those keys. All right, so let's see. So let's talk about, actually, let's skip this slide. So let's talk about encryption in transit. So what we were talking about previously was encrypting data that might be in a database or on a hard disk or on an S3 bucket. But we also use encryption between websites. So the most common encryption that people are probably familiar with is TLS, what we used to call SSL. It's been around for decades, but we also use encryption on your cellular connection between you and your cell tower. Your cable modem line may use encryption. If you're using Wi-Fi, that uses encryption. And really what all these are intended to do is to break what we call man-in-the-middle attacks. And so what a man-in-the-middle attack is, as an attacker, if I can get your traffic to go through a endpoint that I control, and there's lots of fun different ways to do this. It's a very common interview question that I ask people when I'm interviewing them for security positions. If there's a way that I can get your traffic to go through me, I can see it. And so I can get your secrets, like your passwords. I can also mess with it, right? So if, say, you're putting in an order to buy something from Amazon and I can mess with that, I can change it to order 1,000 things from Amazon and it'll still look perfectly legit. So without protocols like these, it's trivially easy to intercept secrets and to mess with data. If encryption in transit isn't there, those left 4 nodes of the cyber kill chain are much, much easier to execute. That said, things like TLS are incredibly common. They're almost pedestrian at this point. So if a client can't, or sorry, a particular third party can't offer encryption in transit, I would consider that a huge red flag. But all that said, there are things that we can do, compensating controls that we can do. Let's say that the only network flows that they couldn't do that on were inside a data center, and there's lots of good physical security, and perhaps the network cables themselves are shielded inside armor or inside concrete, then we might not worry about it quite so much. Okay, so this one is super, super important. So the most common cause for information security breaches is administrative error. Somebody made an error in setting something up, and they might not have TLS configured correctly. S3 buckets that store data, it's increasingly commonplace to store data, might be publicly accessible. People accidentally expose administrative consoles for applications. It just goes on and on. And as a environment becomes larger and more complex and more humans touch systems, it becomes more and more likely. Where you're seeing this most, of course, is where you see the most manual approaches, right? So if an admin is going through and pointing and clicking, it doesn't matter how careful you are, how many eyes you have on it, inevitably somebody's going to make a mistake somewhere. And so the only solution to this is to create blessed and frequently reviewed configuration standards and to automatically apply them to existing and new infrastructure. We call this practice configuration management. And it's important too to regularly test the infrastructure to make sure that a key configuration setting that might not have been necessary yesterday, but is today, that actually is happening, that those controls are in place. So if we have solid automated configuration management, it makes it much harder to reconnaissance, deliver, and exploit your target in terms of the kill chain. Throughout this presentation, I'm trying to note where there are good compensating controls, but there just isn't one here. Like, you have to do automated configuration management, or you're going to at some point configure your systems incorrectly and open yourself up to breach. I've been running through this quite a bit, and I haven't been monitoring the chat. Do we have questions, or are folks just listening along?
We do have
I would,
questions.
yeah.
Oh, Alex, if you want to pull them out, you go for it.
No, I was just going to say, why don't we keep going and just get through a little more of these and then take a break? Because I know there were some questions about insurance too, which I thought were good, and we can wrap up with the questions at the end.
Great, Alex. Good idea. Okay. So let's talk about authentication then for just a moment. So phishing, as I mentioned earlier, is still very common and effective. It can happen via email, voice, web application attacks, SMS, Slack. Any human communication channel is vulnerable to phishing. A long time ago, we worried a lot about people brute forcing passwords, right? So trying every possible password string or all the passwords that existed in dictionaries. It's much rarer these days. But a lot of the authentication standards that you see will rely on things like password complexity and length and changing them frequently. And those are all intended to thwart brute force attacks. And in my opinion, what's much more important, and this aligns with other industry standards as well, as two-factor authentication. So a lot of two-factor authentication methods themselves are susceptible to phishing. So SMS-based, or getting a text from somebody, those can be phished, right? So you can put up a fake form and say, what's your password? What's your 2FA code? I'm Wells Fargo, pinky swear. I'm totally not a bad guy. And those can be phished and then immediately used to give an attacker access to your accounts. There are newer best of breed methods like passkeys, FIDO2, WebAuthn, and other things that you may see in security contracts that are considered best of breed because they're phishing resistant. You cannot use them for a different website. The technology won't allow you to, than the one that's configured for that authenticator. As you're looking through security exhibits, consider those better best of breed methods for privileged access. And again, specifically, I would be wary of two-factor methods that use SMS. Really what that does is it puts all of your client security in the hands of the cellular provider. And if their security is great, then they won't cough up that access, but it's not always. This control helps with controlling delivery and exploitation in the cyber kill chain. And again, there's really no effective substitute controls here. So next, let's talk. Go ahead.
Gary, sorry. There's one question that may be on point. So what is the real world effect of InfoSec exhibits? Obviously, there's the breach and remedy, the legal side, but from a day-to-day, are you on the technical side enforcing these, monitoring these? Like, what can you do in situations where you don't have visibility into the protocol, where you can't see if encryption is being used with communication from your company to another, but it's more about the back end? How often are you exercising audit rights?
That's a great question. And it really depends on the vendor. So often I don't have audit rights at all. Right? If we're talking, particularly if we're talking about a large multi-tenant vendor, like say Office 365, right? I'm not getting into Microsoft's data centers to audit their stuff. So in those cases, I'm really relying on their third-party audit reports, the SOC 2s, and making sure that the controls that I care about are in those reports. They have a business incentive to make sure that those controls are in place. For smaller vendors, though, this can be a real challenge. I agree. And also, it just doesn't scale for me to audit hundreds of different vendors. I would be doing nothing else. So it's really a balance. You might do audits on your most sensitive vendors, but you're probably relying in large part on third parties and their reports for that. Anna, welcome back. Do you have something more to add here?
No, but I just have power again, which is exciting.
Yay! Awesome. And
Yay.
I'm glad your house isn't a smoking hole. That makes me happy.
No, it seems like it's been put out there, but yeah. But no, I do think it's the other thing that I think is great to know about audit rights is I always find when you're negotiating these, you have your spend of what you can negotiate. And sometimes I tell people like, we maybe don't want to waste if we could get a concession, we maybe don't want to waste it arguing this point, especially if it's with a large provider. So think about what you really can get, what's going to be really meaningfully move the needle, I think, from a security standpoint, because you can't negotiate these. I think it's not exactly like a agreement where you could go on every single line and negotiate every point. There are limitations, I think, just technologically to what a vendor or another party can provide to you.
Great point.
Yeah, and I can say from like the provider side, especially at a smaller company, I'm really hesitant to agree to like audit rights for folks to come in to audit our company, mostly because we're a smaller company. Like we don't, you don't want to divert resources to handle audit because they could be pretty significant, right? And we go through like the SOC 2 certification every year. Often that is enough to provide comfort.
Yeah,
So
also
what-
for the bigger vendors. So again, like I worked for Facebook and Apple here, they're making assurances to all their customers that third parties aren't going to have physical access to their stuff, right? So in some cases, it could be creating a breach of their obligations if they allow you that audit access. So there are a lot of considerations there. Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, there was another interesting question, which is how important is it for legal to have insight and input into the security program protocols? So John, from your point of view as a general counsel, are you really getting input into the actual protocol used? Like obviously you're going to be all over the drafting and want to make sure the agreement's in place, but what about the technical measures themselves?
Yeah, I guess in terms of the actual like specific technical measures, I usually defer to the experts really. But that being said, you do need to make sure everything's consistent in terms of the vendors you use and what you actually agree to, so that to make sure you're not agreeing to something that isn't true on the vendor or your sub-processors that you use. So that I think that's the key thing. And also it depends on the business, right? If it is more like regulated type of business, then you obviously need to be more careful about that. You need to definitely have more insight and input into the protocols being used and making sure they comply with the regulations.
Yeah, and I would say we get now as outside counsel, we're getting pretty heavily involved in a lot of protocol and technical design simply because it's going to the legal risk of a company. I would also point out if you're in the payment space, Gary, I'm sure you talk a lot about New York DFS or know a lot about that space historically, but New York DFS has a pretty stringent security protocol that they now require for their covered entities. And where you deviate from that protocol, you have to demonstrate that a compensating control has met a legal standard, essentially. And so you're really seeing, I think, a lot more regulations that are demanding cooperation between the information security team and the legal team when it comes to compliance with those new sort of requirements that are becoming popular in the US, and you have them in Europe as well, coming out with NIS2 and DORA.
Yes, I have the phone numbers of several Department of Financial Services auditors in my phone right now from my past life. Yep, so very familiar with those guys.
Yes, they love to
want
answer questions. Yeah, so
they do. Just a quick time check. We are done in 15 minutes here, correct?
That
Yeah.
is correct. Yeah. And we've been answering questions as we go. If we need to bump up against that 15 minutes with the presentation, that's okay if we keep addressing some questions. And again, if we don't get everyone's questions, we apologize, but you can feel free to reach out to our amazing presenters after as well.
Yeah, happy to do that. I'm going to breeze through the last of these then in the hopes that we can get through them quickly. And I think we can do so without compromising on quality too much. Let's just talk about patching and vulnerability management for a second. So this is critically important. If an attacker can find vulnerable software sitting at the edge of your network, they again bypass these entire leftmost 3 steps. And so it's usually pretty easy for an attacker to just scan your network and see what might be vulnerable and then to exploit it. Conversely, this is actually pretty hard for teams to get right. Usually, if you're patching a known vulnerability, they have to find downtime, and sometimes patches can break critical behavior for your application to work. But even though it's hard, there's no way around it. The worst vulnerabilities can break every bit of trust in your security program. If they're exploited, it can take months to clean up the damage. we have to put these into exhibits. We have to have tools for users to actually, for third parties to find and patch vulnerabilities. Additionally, pen testing, penetration testing, or red team testing can be a useful tool to find vulnerabilities that you might not know existed previously. So with these, when we're looking at pen tests, it's important to actually read the pen test to see what was tested and what was in scope. Just like those SOC 2 reports, you can get, if you demand them many times, examples of past pen tests and remediation reports for the vulnerabilities they found. Did they actually fix what the red teamers found? And when you're looking at those pen tests, really look for weighty objectives, like the objectives that line up with the risks that you're most worried about. So are stealing money, stealing access keys, stealing sensitive PII. If it's a software vendor, like whether the red teamer is able to compromise the creation of the software that you're counting on them to deliver cleanly and then that you might run on your network, those sorts of things.
Yeah, so cyber insurance, obviously a huge area for us. We do a lot of just looking at cyber policies, helping you explain coverage, helping you go through your broker and obtain additional coverages. Cyber insurance is super important. It is not a cyber risk management strategy, but it's an important tool in your toolbox. Cyber insurance will help you defray the cost of any incident. We've listed out what it typically covers. For the most part, it's going to cover the cost that you incur if you are the party that had the data breach. One thing to keep in mind is if a third party has a data breach, it's not likely that your cyber cover is going to cover that. So just something to keep in mind. We are seeing it baked into contracts requiring parties to have cyber insurance.
I was going to say, I think she was going to make the point when you're working with a vendor, you can ask for insurance coverage. I was hoping to lean on Anna a bit to tell us about the limits and whatnot, but I think like a normal insurance provision, you can look at, like from a commercial point of view, you can look at scoping the provision. So there's a certain duration of coverage that's required. For example, during the term of the agreement and for 5 years after, there should be insurance that would cover any acts or omissions related to cyber during the course of the relationship. You can probably ask to be an additional insured on the policy. You can ask for copies of the policy for notifications of changes. I think one of the issues will be, which Anna can opine on hopefully when she comes back, the scope of if you have a vendor that gets insurance, the key question is what will that cover? And that obviously will not cover any wrongdoing on your company's part. It will cover wrongdoing on the vendor's part. I don't know, John or Gary, if you have any other thoughts on insurance.
Yeah, so I guess from the provider's point of view, I can say that it obviously depends on like the scale of your business, what the risks are, and who you're talking to. And most I feel like most parties, like even if they're large orgs, like they understand this. And if at the end of the day, like you should have some type of cyber insurance coverage. But if your cyber insurance coverage is 5 million instead of 10 million, like they normally require, like most counterparties aren't going to require you to get a new insurance policy just to enter into this agreement. If your service, if what your company doesn't fit that risk profile that it needs, like that over that higher coverage. And frankly, if your business does need that higher coverage, you should have gotten that policy to begin with. And so I feel like in negotiating these things, like most counterparties are pretty understanding and pretty practical about how to approach insurance. But I guess, and I don't know if Anna will be able to join again, but like the most important thing I think is get the appropriate policy for your type of risk profile for your business to begin with.
Keeping my eye out for her. She hasn't popped back in yet, but if she does, I'll make sure to be on it so I can make her host again. She can pop back.
She said her power got cut off, unfortunately. I think if any of you have follow-up questions on insurance or specifics, Anna would be happy to answer questions later on.
Yes, when her immediate vicinity is not on fire, then she might.
Best excuse ever.
That's true. That's true.
She sent me a photo and there's a flame and a tree and a fire truck out.
Oh my goodness.
I'm surprised she stayed on as long as she did. What a
yeah.
We get through hell and high water here on the In-House Connect webinars. I do want to be conscious of time. I know some people have had to drop already. Any wrap up that we want to do? John, I know if you want to say a few words about Ruli, you're also welcome to do that.
Yeah, and definitely appreciate Gary and Alex and Anna, who unfortunately isn't here right now, to for participating in this. When Alex and I first started talking about doing this, I wanted to do something a bit different than just another pitch about like legal AI. I think like information security is definitely like one of the key issues that a lot of in-house lawyers have to cover. So I think hopefully everybody learned as much as I did on this webinar, and it was super interesting. But yeah, again, I want to express my thanks to Alex and Anna from A&O Shearman and Gary from Adobe. And if you are interested in legal AI platform, there's Ruli. Whoops.
Yes, I'm launching a poll. If anyone's interested in checking Ruli out, you'd let us know and we will pass you along to John afterward. Thank you so much to all of you, including Anna, who unfortunately is not back, but especially for powering through having an active fire near her home. We really appreciate it. This was so great and so educational. We have so many comments saying how wonderful this was. So I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but that is just the nature of the game sometimes. Again, connect with everybody, ask questions of each other. I know a lot of folks were answering each other's questions in the chat, which we love to see. And we have some upcoming events. We have another webinar tomorrow, so go on our upcoming events page and check that out. And tonight, if you were in Charlotte, North Carolina, Shai will be there for an in-person mixer. And tomorrow, if you were in Austin, Texas, he will be there for an in-person mixer. So go sign up for those as well. And thank you so much again to everyone for attending. We really appreciate your time, and we will see you on the next one.